all of a sudden it's like, okay, I don't really know what's going on. I have this Catholic background, but this sounds good. Eastern philosophies, Urantia book, Timothy Leary. So I started digging into everything, but it was also under the influence of these drugs, specifically LSD.
Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast. I am so excited to bring you an in-studio guest, which is not typical for me, but we're going to hopefully start to do more of these in-studio interviews. But I have a very special guest today. This is my dad. Hi, Dad.
Hi, honey. What a pleasure.
Yeah, well, I wanted to have my dad on actually for a while because he just wrote a book that is very good. It's called Rock and Roll Preacher, and the subtitle is From Doo-Wop to Jesus Rock, a pioneer of contemporary Christian music, Chuck Girard. So for those of you who are sort of unfamiliar with, my background, I talk about my own experience being in the Christian music industry. Well, I was raised by a dad who basically pioneered the contemporary Christian music industry along with some other people. And so I know it might seem kind of odd, like, why are we doing this topic for an apologetics podcast? But I actually have a really important reason that I wanted to talk to you, Dad, about this whole phenomenon of deconstruction. And I know we've talked just a little bit about this, but one thing occurred to me as I think about all of these people who grew up in church and they're deconstructing their faith now. And I always thought about you and I want you to kind of in a moment share your story with us, because I always thought, my dad, you tried all these different things, Eastern Mysticism, drugs, all kinds of stuff. And then when you heard the simplicity of the gospel, it's almost like at that point there was nothing to deconstruct. And so I thought maybe you could just walk us back through your story a little bit. By the way, he has the most fascinating life. Like, you're not even going to believe some of the things we're going to get into in this podcast. But start with your childhood. Like, what kind of a home were you raised in? Was it religious, non-religious?
Well, first of all, something I need to make clear on my Amazon page, this is nonfiction. This is my autobiography.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it could be a made-up story. Rock and Roll Preacher. It sounds like a cool...
Yeah, I mean, we're talking interacting with Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, being a session singer in Los Angeles as a young teenager, really, or late teens.
Well, early 20s.
Early 20s.
21-ish.
You had a #1 hit as a 16-year-old? Top 10, okay. And then forming arguably the first Christian rock band to become successful. So anyway, but let's go back to your childhood here.
Right.
And we'll get into all that.
Well, I was raised in a legalistic Catholic home, okay? And church on Sunday was mandatory and all the rules and regulations that go with it. And so I just, I was prone to want to follow God, and, I didn't resist it. I didn't really enjoy it that much, but it was what we did. And so anyhow, there came a kind of a moment of truth when I was about 15 or 16, and the doctrine at that time was that you could go to hell for eating meat on Friday.
Wow.
Because it was a day where you were supposed to fast meat and eat fish, eating something like that.
Yeah.
So I thought, if I'm going to hell for eating meat on Friday, I'm going to go out and go to hell for whiskey and women. And it really
go out with a bang if you're going to go.
Seriously, have some fun on my way out,
Yeah.
So I really did. That's actually a serious thought. And I went out and I got into the worldly lifestyle, and then I connected with music. I was about a junior in high school. I started getting into the idea that I could perform music, and I put together a little doo-wop group in high school. And we went down to Hollywood, and we met a local DJ named Dan Dillon. He is now deceased. I talked to Dan about 5 years ago for the first time in 50, 60 years. And he had some connections in Hollywood, and we made a little demo in San Francisco. My mom financed it with $100.
Wow.
And we had a piano and a guitarist on it. And we took it down to Hollywood, and we knocked on doors. Make a long story short, we got a recording contract with a fairly hot label at the time called Era. And just for the trivia folks, they had a couple of hot records at the time, Mission Bell by Donnie Brooks and Wayward Wind was a little earlier by Gogi Grant. So they had a track record, and it was a pretty exciting thing to be on that label. And when we recorded, we used guys that were now legends. They're called the Wrecking Crew, and they were just Glenn Campbell and Leon Russell and, and Hal Blaine at the time. They were the studio guys. No one thought too much about it. They were the guys you hired. But looking back on it, working with legendary musicians, Leon Russell and Glenn Campbell weren't even famous yet. I didn't, know who they were apart from the other musicians. So that was our first experiences. We got a couple of songs on the charts. The group was the Castells, and we had 2 top 20 hits. Then I don't know if I'm going in the right direction for you right now, but then that group disbanded. We stopped having records that were succeeding. We had another label deal and nothing went anywhere, so we kind of disbanded. And I met a guy through the Castells and doing some of these sock hop things we did for promotion, where you'd go in and you'd lip sync your record and kids would come and they get to see you, but you didn't really perform, you lip synced. So I met a guy named Gary Usher, and Gary Usher had co-written a big song with Brian Wilson called In My Room, and he was doing studio work and doing a lot of kind of, hot rod surf, Beach Boy type stuff. And he liked my voice. And he said, do you want to make some extra money? You can work in the studio for me and make union scale. You have to join the union. And so I started doing that. I was first of all, just doing backgrounds, the ooh-ah, because I was under contract at that time. And I didn't want to be legally breaching my contract. But he said, well, Brian's doing it. Brian Wilson's doing it on the Jan and Dean records, and he's getting away with it. So I think
it's just like
safe.
Singing backgrounds. In other
no,
words,
you'd actually, mostly background. But in my case, he wanted me to sing lead. But the difference was the voice I used on those surf records was sort of a rip-off of the Beach Boys, and I'd sing through my nose. So it didn't really sound like my Castell records, and I never got called on the carpet for it. So that went on for about 4 years, and I made a bunch of records with Gary. Really,
how old were you at this point?
I was about 21.
Okay.
And I was alcoholic at this time, and I'd work all day and make a bucket of money for a young guy of my age, union scale, and then go on to my favorite bar at night and drink beer and shoot pool. And that was my life for about 4 years. And then one day we'd made this record. We delivered it to Mercury Records. The guy that ran the label was a guy named Nick Benet, who had been the Beach Boys' first producer at Capitol. And he'd moved to Mercury. We made this record and delivered it. I'm driving down the street about a month later, and I hear this track come on the radio, and I go, I know that song. And then I'm listening. Wait, that's me. And it was a song called Little Honda by the Hondells. When we delivered the album to Nick, we didn't even know they were going to call it the Hondells. He said, well, we don't know. We're going to either call you the Rising Suns or the Hondells. We haven't decided, because it was all their deal. It was work for hire. So we had this top 10 record this time, and that went up on the charts. And then they put together a group to go travel. I didn't want to do that. I stayed in the studio. And that kind of led into, that season of my life led into the hippie connection, which came a little later. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, so before we get into the hippie, sort of the hippie phase of your life, because this is, I think, the phase when you really began actively searching for God, I'd love if you could share, because I learned so many fun things by reading your book, just things I didn't know about your life. I mean, such a fascinating life. So one thing I wasn't aware of, I think I did know this before I read the book, but I don't think I knew this until I was an adult. And that's that you actually worked with Keith Green before either one of you were even Christians. And so for the...
You didn't know that?
Well, not till recently.
Okay.
So for the young whippersnappers watching who might not even know who Keith Green is, a very well-known Christian artist back in the, when did he die? In the 80
early
80s,
or 2? 80, yeah.
Okay, really, you can go back and look at some of his, there's a bunch of Keith Green videos on YouTube, and many listeners and viewers will be very familiar with Keith Green.
Truly one of the great icons of contemporary Christian music.
Exactly. And so tell the story of both of you before either one of you were even Christians.
Exactly. Well, Gary had sort of graduated out of the, by this time he'd produced a Byrds album, which was a big folk rock group. And he was kind of interested in moving into other kinds of music. So our recording shifted, and we recorded some Bob Dylan songs, and we were trying to, move the genre from hot rod surf. And in the context of all that, he had a couple of young artists that were, really young. Keith was about 13, and then this young girl, 14 or 15, named Beverly Williams. So we would do background on their records. And I didn't know Keith from anybody at that time. He was just this kid. And so Gary, gave me the call. He said, we're going to record this kid named Keith Green, and, come in and we'll sing background and get paid. So we did these 6 sides. Keith was on Decca Records, and we cut 6 songs, and I think it was 6 total, and that was it. And we didn't know if there was going to be an album or not, but 6 is all we did. Then I lost track of him.
Now, how old was he at this? He was about
young. 13.
Yeah, 13 or 14.
Time.
Yeah,
and he was rocking. I mean, even at that time, it is actually a clip on YouTube of him on. I think it's I've Got a Secret, black and white TV, and his secret was I'm the youngest kid to ever be signed to a rock music contract as a rock musician.
Yeah.
That was his secret. You can find it on YouTube. So anyhow, young, he played and sang at the same time and killed it. He was really good. So I lost track of him, and then about 10 years later, which I'm hopping ahead a little bit, but I have to bring this story to a close, and we can come back to this. The Vineyard started in my living room, and there was a bunch of people now. It was a church finally after about a year, and we found a building. And people were coming up to me and saying, "This a guy named Keith Green got saved, says he knows you." And I'm relating to this 13-year-old kid, not realizing 10 or 11 years had gone by, so he'd be 23 or 4 now. And I thought, couldn't be that guy. And then I said, well, it could be. And then finally we made the connection, and it was him. And my biggest question was, how did you remember me? My name and everything, to tell people you knew me from before, because we were just 3 guys. I'm sure we introduced ourselves and stuff, but who remembers names? So somehow he remembered me, and I kind of helped kickstart his whole thing. Wow. When I couldn't do I was fairly well booked up in those days. I had a lot of people asking me to do services, and if I had a date that I had, someone called me up, saying, "Can you do this date?" And I was busy. I'd say, "Well, why don't you call this young guy? He's up and coming." A couple of times he opened for me, and then a year and a half later, I was number 100 with an anchor, and he's.
It's like the one time, Toby Mac opened for Zoe Girl. It was. Yeah, and I'm only laughing because it's such a joke. I mean, DC Talk had just kind of disbanded, and so Zoe Girl had this really successful album, and Toby was coming out with his first album, and so the label was trying to decide at this sort of sales conference who's going to open for who. And I'm only laughing because it's so ridiculous to think that we would have ever, that he would have ever opened for us. But they decided that Zoe Girl was going to close and Toby was going to open. And let me just tell you, it never happened again.
Yeah, right. A real quick story. It's not about Christian music, but one of the most famous stories. It may be an urban legend, but it's Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis. They're equal in popularity. They do this show, and the guy says they're trying to figure out who's going to go on first. So finally they decide that Chuck Berry is going to headline. So that means that Jerry Lee would go on before Chuck, because he's coming out to headline. So Jerry Lee's upset about it. He goes out to do his set, and at the very end, this is how the story goes. He took lighter fluid out and lit the piano on fire and kicked it into the audience, and then he walks off the stage, he looks at Chuck Berry and says, "Follow that."
That's sort of what Toby Mac did, minus the actual fire. Yeah. But that's kind of how it went.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Then we came out, and everybody was way too exhausted to
care. You guys were great.
Well, no, I know, but it's just but I love Toby. It's just he's gonna make sure, okay. Yeah. All right, so let's move into the hippie time, because I think the reason also that this is also relevant, I think, is the book that I just wrote is very personal. It's very much my story of walking through my own kind of faith crisis, which involved some deconstruction of a lot of the ideas that I grew up thinking, and of course, when I reconstructed, some of those remained intact, and others changed a bit. And I know that you had a similar sort of experience as you walked through your spiritual journey. But I think when I think back at being in that classroom situation where my faith was so challenged, I know that so much of the reason that my faith wasn't completely taken away was this part of it was the backstory of your story. For example, I grew up I was never under the impression that it was forbidden to ask certain questions. Mm-hmm. I never felt like there was a spiritual question that was off the table. And I think part of that is due to you and Mom and the way that you were very open about critical thinking. I remember we would be driving home from church, and I would hear the two of you talk about which parts you agreed with, which parts you didn't agree with. I never was under the impression that I just had to consume what was given to me uncritically and just believe it because it's some kind of blind leap of faith. I also remember there being other religious books around the house. Like I remember opening a drawer and there was a Book of Mormon in there. There's the Urantia book, which we talked about on a Facebook live stream recently. And so I never felt like other ideas were scary or inaccessible, or I wasn't allowed to explore that or something like that. And I think that's a huge reason why I didn't feel such a need to deconstruct everything I believed, because I never felt like I was forced to believe it or that it was a blind leap in the first place. And so I wanted to set that up because I think your story is really pertinent to that as far as your journey as a hippie through all of these different things to try to find God. Of course, it was an entirely different time. People aren't really necessarily searching for God right now. In fact, we see this whole phenomenon of deconstruction almost becoming its own religion. It's almost becoming this sort of virtuous thing to do, is if you were raised in the church, to deconstruct all of that and sort of find your own truth and live your own truth. But you started with that, and then you found the truth, which I think is such an interesting way. So what was maybe what started off your search for God, or whatever you would have called it at the time, the divine, or I don't know what you would have called it at the time?
Well, to be fair, it was really the drug experience for me, and I'm very careful in my book to let people know, because I do speak about some of the positive aspects. There's positive aspects to all sin, you know, but
in the sense that it's fun for a season,
fun for a season, but the end thereof is death.
Yeah.
And so I felt this connection to seek this God thing that was actually a counterfeit as I look back on it, but it seemed real at the time. And at that point, all rules were off the table. That's the important point. Yeah. Okay. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, I don't really know what's going on. I have this Catholic background, but this sounds good. Eastern philosophies, Urantia book, Timothy Leary. So I started digging into everything, but it was also under the influence of these drugs, specifically LSD. So we were getting a lot of, and when I say we, later on there was a whole little commune of us, about 7 or 8 of us, hippie seekers, not really a commune living together, although we did for a season, but bound together by a common goal to find God. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on. That was what was happening, though, in the 60s. You know, the Beatles had come out. They had, Bob Dylan and the Beatles had publicly proclaimed that they had taken LSD. So we think, oh, they're our prophets. They're on our trip.
Yeah.
And so George Harrison becomes a Buddhist, and we go, oh, maybe that's George Harrison. You know, this guy does that. What is it? Mike Love, Maharishi Yoga. So really digging deep into everything. But at the very end of at the very core of the whole thing, because the Holy Spirit was still in control, in my opinion, okay, there was this sort of like process of elimination for me. At least speak for myself. Yeah, this seems too much like works, you know. I didn't even know the difference particularly, but it seems like only the gurus can reach nirvana. So I don't know if that's for the common people. And I kept kind of really edging more and more toward the Bible. We were reading the Bible, of course, at the same time. And it seemed to me, first of all, having been raised Catholic, I started off with the proposition that whatever I wound up with had to include Jesus unless there was no God. And then that would be a different story. But if whatever system I chose, and he'd have to be more than just, you know, like he is in some of the religions, he's one of the prophets. He'd have to really be special. So as I kept weeding through all that stuff, it kept coming up Christianity. I remember I didn't know him by voice, but I did know him by name, who I'm going to mention. I'm driving down the street, and I hear this very common sense truth coming out of the radio. I thought, that guy's nailing it. Who's that? That's exactly what Billy Graham.
Wow.
Right? So I go, okay, that was Christian. And I didn't know who it was, so I couldn't make a judgment of, oh, this is Billy Graham. You know, he's just, whoever this is speaking truth. So that kept just moving me closer and closer. By this time, we'll call it the eve of my conversion, the eve weeks. We were in a lot of trouble for drugs. God was lowering the net, bringing in the net. And we're all living in a kind of a luxurious house above the Pacific Ocean in South Laguna, California. Beautiful home. I don't know how we managed to rent it. It was sort of a hippie commune, but we're all miserable. There's the names people might know as Fred Field lived there, J. Truax lived there for a while, Tommy Coombs, some of the Love Song guys. And we were all trying to figure it out, but, this guy went to jail, this guy is on trial, goes to trial. I was myself busted in Las Vegas, and I was waiting trial when I became a Christian. So we're all sitting there in these, the dream is over kind of feeling, like this is what's going on. It's all in detail in my book, but just for time's sake. And then we start hearing about Calvary Chapel. And by picking up hitchhikers, which we used to do to get free drugs, because if you pick up a hippie, he might have a lit of weed, and you say, hey, man, you want a joint? Now we're picking these guys up, and they're saying, oh, man, we found Jesus. You guys should look into Jesus. And we go, well, we're looking for him. Where'd you find him? Calvary Chapel, Calvary Chapel, Calvary Chapel. Keeps coming up. What's up with this Calvary Chapel, So one night... we're having a little theological discussion under the influence of something in the Laguna house, and the doctrine of tongues comes up. And I had a negative experience with tongues. We used to go up on this little hill behind the house, and I'd bring my guitar up there, and I'd sing. And I would sing in free verse, just whatever, no words. But it would, like a couple of times it brought real darkness. And that's not good. And I'd put my guitar down and go in the house. So I thought, why is this in the Bible? Because that was not good. Wow. Well, let's find out. So we went down to this hippie commune in Newport Beach called the Blue Top, where Lonnie Frisbee was some of the folks know that name. There was a bunch of hippies living
let me just for people who kind of don't know who some of these people are. So Lonnie Frisbee was the famous hippie preacher that started at sort of in that Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, but he wasn't there very long, right? He moved on to the Vineyard movement after that or something. But he's kind of a controversial figure because he had some sin struggles in his life that are kind of famous, well known. But so Lonnie Frisbee, the famous hippie preacher, is essentially who you're talking about.
Exactly. First hippie preacher at Calvary. Yeah. And he was there for a few years, and then he went down to Florida and joined the Bob Mumford group for a while, and then came back. And his big moment coming back into the thing was John Wimber gave him a meeting at Calvary Chapel, Yorba Linda, kind of didn't go down with the Calvary people, and that's when John assumed the Vineyard name. Now, the Vineyard already started, but he just came to Ken Gullickson and he said, can I become a Vineyard? I don't want to do a new charter and all that. So that's what happened there. So that was Lonnie. And where was I with Lonnie? Oh, so he's the head of this commune, and we go up to, I didn't know anybody there. I didn't know Lonnie at that time. We just knew they were hippies that knew the Bible. We wanted to find out about tongues. So we go up to number one, we drive up the driveway and knock on the door. I always like to imagine it was about 7 o'clock and a bunch of hippies were in there just after dinner probably praying, Lord, send us souls. Send us people who need the message of Jesus. Knock on the door. 5 guys with a Bible, stoned. Hey, can you guys tell us what's going on with tongues here? Can you imagine? Right. They're kind of going, whoa.
Is that what they were doing? Were they praying?
I don't know. Oh, okay. I'm only imagining that.
They probably were.
They could have been. Yeah, very likely. I always like to think that, it's a very likely possibility. But they loved on us, and they told us about Calvary, and then we went up, and then eventually, within a short period of time, I committed my life to the Lord. But getting back to sort of the definition of the deconstruction thing, starting off with no rules, and then slowly, by the Holy Spirit, I believe, eliminating stuff that didn't seem to fit or that couldn't see it, and plus the confirmation of what's truth, and you have the Holy Spirit moving in your life. He's saying, no, not that, this. Slowly edging toward Christianity till I, did eventually received the Lord.
So what was the moment? I know that you went to Calvary Chapel, you went to a meeting, and you were by yourself, I think, the night that you actually, that salvation experience happened. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. And what was it, as you searched through all these other things, what was it about what you heard at Calvary Chapel that night that was so different? And, I mean, obviously we know the Holy Spirit had the main role to play there, but in your mind, what was going on?
Well, the odd part about it is I went there hoping I'd see Lonnie, and it was Chuck. So I didn't get the hippie. I got the 42-year-old balding middle-aged guy. But what really happened was it was a moment of truth with the Holy Spirit, because I don't even remember what Chuck preached on that night. I remember walking in, very, very suspicious of the whole thing, getting in the back row so I could get out if I didn't like it, and escape, so to speak. And the first thing that hit me was the music. These kids, hippie kids sitting on a stool, probably Karen Lafferty or whoever it could have been, singing "Seek Ye First the Kingdom of God." And here I am. I'm kind of a sophisticated music guy. I like Pink Floyd. I like progressive music. I like, experimentation. And here's these kids with these little simple songs that are just digging deep into my heart. They're not even really great singers, some of them.
Well, and that's scripture.
Yeah.
That song is straight scripture.
Yeah, that one is, and a lot of them were. And they were writing very scriptural songs. I don't know which ones they were, but the anointing of God, which I didn't even know how to define it, struck my heart, and I just had a catharsis on the spot. The Holy Spirit dug down, and it was like I felt like my philosophy at that time was, I felt because of all this "I'm in you and you and me" stuff on the Beatles records, "I'm in you and we are all together, goo 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 tube," right? I kind of felt like all the world had to become one in saved as en masse in order for all mankind to be saved. So I was sort of carrying this burden of, I got to do my part. Then all of a sudden the Holy Spirit flipped it, and he said, no, this is personal. You take care of you and get you right. So he came in, and this burden lifted off me. I realized I couldn't, I couldn't carry it. I was trying to be a good person, and but it wasn't working. And all of a sudden I just realized how helpless and hopeless I was, and how God, I didn't need to clean up to come to God. I had to come to God, and He'd clean me up. That was sort of the flip that happened, and that took all the guru thing away, where you're achieving levels and studying and works kind of thing. All of a sudden, I realized it's the mercy of God, and it's just surrender.
Would you say there was like a sense of conviction of your sin?
Oh, absolutely.
And like a repentance moment.
Right.
Yeah. Because it's interesting to hear you describe even the Beatles lyrics, and it's all the same stuff we see today.
It's repackaged.
It's all repackaged. It's "we are one." It's this pantheistic sort of approach to this new agey kind of approach to the world, that we are all one. This is why people are striving so hard, I think, in the flesh to create this sort of utopia, because that's the mindset, which is works. It is all works, and it neglects personal holiness. It neglects the human heart. It neglects an individual salvation experience. In fact, there are teachers claiming to be Christians who are actually teaching against individual salvation. They're saying that's not a thing. That's not something that is biblical or is right. But it's kind of falling back into this whole New Age idea of oneness and all of that. And so it's just interesting to hear your story, because it's like the reverse deconstruction. It's like you see the just emptiness of all these other worldviews and all these other systems and all these other behaviors. And then you hear the simplicity of the gospel, and it's like, that's it. And so after that moment, now a lot happened after that too.
Yeah.
Because you did go through, I know that even when I was a little girl, you had, so we mentioned you were in Love Song, which was arguably the first Christian rock band to become successful. You went solo, were very successful as a solo artist. I mean, I remember walking into some church, or I don't know where I was, but seeing a framed cover of you on the cover of CCM magazine, and maybe it was a studio or something. So very successful Christian music artist. You went through a bout of alcoholism, even publicly, I think.
Two, actually.
Two, okay.
As a Christian.
Yes, as a Christian. So it's not like everything was perfect. Right. There were struggles after that. But there were a couple more sort of phases God brought you through after that point. as a part of, I don't know, it's like we're using all of these modern words like deconstruction, construction, but really this is you constructing your faith, right? And that's why I say, because of the way that you came to faith, there just wasn't anything to deconstruct. Nobody's going to come to you today and say, hey, did you know, like, there's this idea that we can all be one? And, you're going to be like, no, I've been there, done that already. There's nothing to deconstruct there. So talk about those next couple of phases that God brought you through in your walk and in your life.
Well, let me go back real quick to deal with your point of, did I know my sin? I always knew. In fact, later on when I did street ministry, we had all these hellfire brimstone preachers, and the philosophy was, you need to let them know they're sinners.
Yeah.
I knew I was a sinner.
Yeah.
And so part of that thing was that I wrote in my song that's about that, called Wind Was Low, I was forgiven, and I knew it. So that was the first thing of, it has to be repentance, and you have to know that why you need God, that you fall short and you can't do it in your own works, and you know how the gospel works. But then the next part of it is, it's just like what happened to me, then sitting under Chuck Smith for years and hearing.
And just for anyone who might be unfamiliar, Chuck Smith being the kind of the founder of Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa, that he's the guy essentially who opened the doors of his church, kind of reluctantly at first, if I understand the history of it.
At the persuasion of his wife.
At the persuasion of his wife. All these hippies were looking for God. And so, he had this very small little church, and he kind of he wasn't sure about, like, all these hippies are wanting to come to church here. And his wife was like, hey, they're coming here to hear the gospel. Preach the gospel to them. And so he did. He opened his doors, and that sort of gave birth to what you might hear referred to as the Jesus movement, which was a very authentic revival. A lot of people write about it now. I've even heard, even preachers I have a certain amount of respect for their biblical exposition and stuff, I've heard them say things like, well, this was a gimmick. This was just, the world's having a hippie movement, so the church is... That's not what happened. This was genuine young people searching for God, and Chuck Smith preached the actual gospel to them, sin and repentance. And so I've even defended a couple of times online, that when people would say, well, they weren't really getting the real gospel. I'm like, well, I can tell you that they were, because he got the real gospel, and you preached to me the real gospel my whole life. And that's what I seek to defend now as well. And so Chuck Smith being kind of the initial teacher that you were sitting under after you were a Christian.
Well, it's kind of what I was going to say, going back to individual salvation. You were raised a Christian, but there was a point in your life where you had to embrace the faith for yourself, right? I'm sure. Yeah. You didn't just go on, well, this is what I've always believed.
And I think that happened very early for me.
Yeah, it can happen at different stages. Well, the same thing happens, in my opinion, with doctrine. You're taught something. Chuck was a great Bible teacher. It was no frills, basic, straight down the line Bible interpretation. But then after I went through I have to kind of deal with the alcohol addiction the first time, was about a 10-year period that I was delivered in 1980. And after I came through that deliverance, God began to challenge my concepts of the faith. And there was a book that I feel he specifically directed me to. It was 365 teachings that went through the whole Bible of this guy that had written this thing for a newspaper to go through a year. And it became this book, and I read that book cover to cover, and it challenged every doctrine. A lot of it was heretical. The guy was off in spots, but it dealt with every doctrine. And then, well, what do I believe about salvation? What do I believe about the Holy Spirit? What do I believe about this? And so that sort of was the first kind of moment of truth. I don't know if you'd call it deconstruction, but actually analyzing what I believed in a critical, is that the right word, way, where you say, okay, this is true. I'm not sure about this. It might have a little bit of a tweak here or there, but it took me through the whole Bible, and I came out of that experience, which was about a year of reading through this book, with a real solid idea of what I believed, and not just what Chuck Smith taught, although most of it was what he taught, because it was pretty right on. It was I was a little more out there. I used to say that my hobby was wholesome heresy, and as soon as I'd hear something I remember when, I'll name some names here, I was going to the Vineyard, and Ken Gullickson was really down on Kenneth Copeland. And he would tell us, don't listen to Kenneth Copeland. Don't read his books. He's heretical. What do I do?
What makes you want to?
I got to go find Kenneth Copeland. So that's. I was always like a little bit more out than Chuck Smith. He was very straight down the line. You know, it's got to fit this mold. Or you know, he would not just say they have error. He'd say they're heretics. And there are a lot of people he'd name. So I was a little more open to kind of experiment with new ideas. But I had that strong anchor of Chuck's teaching. So I'd never got swayed off course for too long. Maybe I'd go into something, you know, I flittered around the edges of the faith movement, and it's a lot of those principles I still believe today that have helped my Christianity that were not part of my Calvary Chapel upbringing. Faith principles, I don't call them faith formulas, but ideas of faith. You know, God's word is true. You can trust it. You know, these kind of things.
Yeah, not that you have to be wealthy and own a Beamer.
Confessing Cadillacs. That was never part of my thing. But through all these different things that happened during that time, I came up with a pretty good idea of what I believed. And it still morphs a little bit as I go through life.
Well, all of us, I think, have to continually go back to the Word and say, okay, you know, is this correct, what I think? And I continue to go on that process myself. Even, you know, things that that I might have gotten from some church service that I grew up with and, you know, go, well, wait, I actually disagree with that, biblically speaking.
Well, you had a lot of opportunity to do that with that class at that church.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You know, you mentioned how God led you. You believe God led you to this book that actually had some heresy in it. Well, I know for a fact God led me to this class. It was the same kind of thing. It was very painful and it was very uncomfortable. But, you know, I know that God, it was absolutely His will that I was there and that I walked through that. And, you know, and it does continue to have lasting effects on my faith. I've wrote in my book that I still feel like when I read the Bible, whereas the innocence of reading that before, there was nothing. I never once opened the Bible as a young child, even as an adult, and went, "Ugh, that's problematic." Not once.
No, yeah.
And now it's like everything seems problematic now that skeptic's voice is in there.
I understand that.
And so there's like this limp that you walk with after you have an experience like that. But I know that was like my book that God led me to is to challenge. It literally challenged everything I believed, and I had to really get real about, okay, you know, and I wouldn't say that that's the first time I owned my faith. I actually think I owned my faith for myself as a very young child. I don't even know if you remember, but I remember disagreeing with you guys on some things at like 10 years old and saying, I don't know if I agree with that. So I definitely, you know, I get it honest, as Mike would say. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree there, but I also felt like you guys kind of respected that when I did that.
Oh, we always do. Of course. We never wanted you guys to. We loved your questions. You know, one of the things, you know, we've been as failure of parents as anybody. That's the sort of the thing that we imparted that I'm the most, I won't say proud, but pleased about.
Yeah, definitely. So let's just as we kind of round out this section of our talk here. I want to move into the alcoholism a little bit because I feel like one thing I know that I just mentioned to my patrons that I finished reading the book I'm just finishing reading the book Becoming Elizabeth Elliot, which is the biography of Elizabeth Elliot's life. You know, the famous missionary who her husband was killed by the tribes people.
Oh, yeah, I know the
Ecuador.
story, but I didn't know that's her name. Yeah, they went down there and they got killed.
Yeah, they got speared, and so she ended up going back. But they've just written her biography, and you know, I grew up reading her books. I read Passion and Purity when I was young, and I knew that story really well. And it was so encouraging to me to read that she struggled with depression quite a bit, actually. After her husband was killed by, you know, the tribes people there in Ecuador, she struggled with loneliness, with depression. She even talked in her journal, which really shocked me because she's like the icon of purity. But she talked about the struggle with what she called sex hunger, you know. And I'm like, wow, well, if Elizabeth Elliot struggled with depression and sex hunger, like, we're all doing okay, all right? It's going to be all right. But that's what I find so encouraging about your story is that even after all of this, you continue, you know, you had a couple of bouts with alcoholism that were a great struggle. And I know that you know, they were public because you were a well-known Christian. Talk a bit about that, what that was like, and what do you think contributed to that?
Well, it was just my addictive personality. You know, I discovered alcohol when I was 15 and drank from that age all the way up to where I became a hippie. Then I discovered marijuana first. I thought, why did I waste all this money on alcohol when I could have been buying weed? Then going into the LSD thing. And so when I became a Christian, I probably had about 12 years of almost every day of my life, my consciousness was altered by some chemical or drug or alcohol or whatever. So I didn't do normal very well. And I did have this kind of cloak of depression on me, speaking of this lady. And just felt, you know, I was excited to be serving the Lord, and I felt like I was delivered from drugs, but I still had this kind of thing like I wasn't filled with joy, and you know, I had peace. I knew I was going to heaven and all that. So I found what I call the loophole scriptures in the Bible. Take a little wine for your stomach's infirmity. Jesus turned the water into wine, and whether we debate that was alcoholic wine or not, I believe it was. But to me, it gave me permission to drink if I didn't get drunk. Well, through those 10 years, one thing progressed to another because I'm an addictive guy, and I kind of get into it and I go for it. By the end of the 70s, about 79, my life was in shambles. I felt so hypocritical. I'd go on stage. I felt I was a hypocrite, and I was to a large degree. Then I got delivered in 1980, roughly, so late 79. Really delivered. I mean, it was like this whole thing lifted off me, and I was completely dry for 16, 17 years, and then, like stupid people do sometimes, not that I'm stupid, but I'm stupid in this area, I started going to Europe a lot. There were some military people. You went, I think.
Yeah,
right?
Germany, I remember.
Yeah, with the DeMonts. And then I started going alone after the first few visits. Only one visit with the family, I think. And then I started going
just
back
that
alone.
one, yeah.
And, you know, they drink alcohol over there like water. And so they would come at the end of a meal. They bring you a little aperitif, a little liqueur. That wasn't even, you didn't order it. They just brought it like a free thing, like they bring chips when you go to a Mexican restaurant. Well, my friends didn't drink, so they'd go out to the car, and I'd say, "Oh, I left my glasses on the table." I'd go back, and I thought, here was my rationale. I'm healed now. I can drink like normal people. Well, the first signal should have been I had to do it in secret.
Right? Yeah. So everybody go to the car. I'll be right back.
Because I'm healed. Well, I was obviously deceived, and the dog returns to his vomit and all that stuff. And that was about a 3-year period, but it was maybe in some ways even darker than the first time because I was back in the mud. And then one day I got up, and I looked in the mirror. I knew it was the Lord confirming and me seeing. I looked in the mirror and I said, "You're a dead man in 6 months if you don't stop." And I didn't go to this time. The other thing was a year process. I was dry that year, but it was a tough year. This was instantaneous. Wow. It was end of 1999. And I never looked back, and I haven't had a drink of alcohol since 1999. So I had to go through twice. But here's I even questioned that, like, God, why did I have to do this again, you know? But there's a real important takeaway. The first time when I got delivered, I did it for everybody else. I can't bring shame to the name of God. Look what I'm doing to Karen, my family. The second time, I did it for me. I didn't want it really there. I thought if I could get out of this and I could drink again, I would do it because I like it. This place, this point, was so close to death, I thought, you know, this is the nail in the coffin. So that's kind of the nutshell on that. And there were some very, very devastating experiences in the context of all that. And it feels so good to be free from that. I have other things I deal with now, as we always do.
We all?
You know, oh, I got rid of that. Oh, whoops, okay, I got this now. But that was the biggie. And so it's been great to be free from that. And, you know, I always like to end these little talks with these thoughts. First of all, I don't believe I'll ever have a drink of alcohol again, but the scripture says, be careful when you think you stand lest you fall, because I've seen how fragile that can be, how quickly you can something can trigger you and you can fall into some kind of sin. So I'm always cautious of that. I'm never, what's the word?
Overconfident?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's the main point.
Well, in just a moment, we're going to go into our subscriber portion for the Patreon group. If you go to patreon.com/Alisa Childers, you can check out all the different tiers. So the first tier is going to give you access to a monthly ministry update video. You can go up a tier for early access to podcasts like this one. You can go up a couple tiers for exclusive bonus content, which we're about to record a little bonus shorter episode exclusive. So if you select, I believe that's tier 4 for that one. Other tiers will get you a free book. You can check it all out on patreon.com/Alisa Childers. But as we close out, Dad, this portion for our general podcast, if somebody happens to be watching this or listening to this today, and they might be going through their own kind of process of deconstruction, maybe they grew up in the church, and there are so many voices out in the, blog sphere, in the internet and social media that are pulling everybody in 100 different directions. I think it's a unique challenge to this generation that we've never seen before.
Absolutely.
Just the shared information that we have access to today. And I think it's been so confusing for so many people. What word of encouragement would you leave people with if they might be going through their own process? Like, I'm having this crisis. I'm doubting everything I was ever taught. What would your advice to them be?
Well, here's a couple of thoughts that are out there now. There's the don't idolize the Bible thought, where they say, this is a book. You have to hear from the Holy Spirit. And then there's people who it's all just about the book and there's no Holy Spirit involved. So with many things, it's a balance. It's a dynamic in between those two things. I feel like, the old cliche, follow your heart. To a certain degree, you have to hear from the Holy Spirit, but it has to line up with the Word.
Right.
So that's the real key there. Like if you're talking to anybody about philosophies of life, the first thing you figure out is if they don't believe in the Bible, you might as well not have the conversation because you have no point of reference that you could both agree on to argue anything. If a guy wants to say, I've worshipped this potato for the last 10 years and every day I do prayers to the potato and I've had a great life, how do I argue with that guy if he says I don't believe the Bible? If the potato works for you, I kind of don't have much to say to you because you're not going to, if you believe that. So we have to establish first that the Bible's the Word of God. And then when as we get this stuff off Facebook or wherever you get it and it kind of knocks you for a loop and you go, how can they believe that? It has to line up with Scripture. That's the actual balance, the litmus test for anything that's said. You have to be careful because a lot of things sound really good today. But they're not biblical.
Yeah.
And the Bible says that Satan comes as an angel of light and a minister of righteousness.
Yeah.
That's how it was with us. We never saw a red boogeyman devil. We always saw, everything we saw was God as a sweet, peaceful, loving, peace and love hippie, So it's a very easy thing. I've often made the point, it's easier to make the distinction between, let's say, a Christian doctrine and Satanism. Most people would say, okay, that's bad because it's about hell and death and damnation. But in the middle, you've got like a Mormonism or a Jehovah's Witness would say a certain percentage of truth with just enough lie. Your Rancher book is a good example to draw you astray. It's harder to make that distinction. So you have to trust the inner voice, but make sure it lines up with the Spirit, I guess, would be with the book, with the Bible.
And that's the test, really, is because I've had definite times in my life where I believe the Holy Spirit was leading me and it lined up with Scripture very strongly. And then I've had other times where I kind of couldn't tell and my heart was actually lying to me. My heart was, everybody's got a different sort of chemical composition inside. Some people they lean way more dramatic, way more romantic, way more stoic. And so some of those things can actually be blockages to truth. And that's why I always try to encourage my listeners and my viewers to the Bible is the final authority. And if your heart disagrees, we are going to read things in the Bible that hit us wrong or that kind of go against something instinctively. But like you said, as Christians who have we have the Holy Spirit dwelling inside of us to help with that process. And and that, using the Bible is that final standard and that doesn't mean we're worshiping it, you know.
Right,
and that's the thing
point, yeah.
that is so bizarre to me, is how people will make leaps so quickly and not really allow for much nuance in the conversation at all. But anyway, well, Dad, it's been so great.
Well, let me add this. It's good to realize, too, that Jesus is the Word made flesh. So in a way, the book is Jesus, but it is still just a book. So the truth contained within is the actual reality of Jesus, in the sense that he came to give that word.
Yeah.
So there's a relationship, but you don't separate them.
Right, because a lot of, especially in the progressive church, like people will say, well, Jesus is the living word, not the Bible.
Right.
And it's like, well, if you look at what the living word said about the written word, he called it the Word of God. So it wasn't a contradiction for him, obviously. So I think that's a good way to look at it.
But I think this is very important, and I'll make a little plug for your book here, which I've only half read, but it's
only
amazing.
Half read it.
It's only read through half of it, but it's so amazing, and it is so clear. It's an important book, a very important, it may be the most important book out there right now, and not just because you're Alisa, but as I read it, I think people need so badly to hear the message of your book. It's so clear. You don't have to, you're not swimming in all kinds of concepts you can't understand, and you make it very accessible to the common man, and it's really helping me, and I think it's an important book for everybody to check into. Yeah.
My dad says you should read my book, so you should get on that.
That's
but
right.
Thank you so much for watching today. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe and click that little bell icon, because that will let you know every time we release a new video. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes or Spotify, it really helps us if you leave a good review. It helps get the word out to more people. And so thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.